In the vast theater of global power, nations rise and fall like tides upon the ocean. Yet in the heart of Asia, a sleeping giant has stirred, quietly, deliberately, and with a force concealed from the world's gaze. India, long known for its spirit, culture, and resilience, now reveals a power hidden in shadows. A revelation so profound, it unsettles even the mightiest of empires. This is not merely a tale of weapons or strategy. It is the story of a nation's awakening and the shockwaves it sends across oceans, reaching America's very doorstep. The silent rise of India's nuclear capability begins not with a roar, but with the stillness of intention, with a quiet determination embedded deep within the consciousness of a nation that has endured centuries of challenge and conquest. To the outside world, India was often seen through the lens of tradition, spirituality, and its vast cultural legacy. Yet beneath this image lay another narrative, one that the world either ignored or underestimated. This narrative was the pursuit of strength, not born of aggression, but of necessity. For decades, India carried the weight of regional instability, surrounded by nuclear neighbors and great power politics pressing in from every side. In such an environment, silence became a shield, secrecy became a weapon, and patience became the most valuable resource of all. In laboratories hidden away from the glare of global eyes, in desert sands where silence stretched to the horizon, scientists and strategists worked relentlessly, not for applause, not for recognition, but for survival and respect. Each test, each calculation, each guarded conversation was a step toward creating something that could change the balance of power forever. Yet the beauty of India's rise lay not in declarations or threats, but in its subtlety. Where others boasted, India observed. Where others displayed, India concealed. It was this very restraint that amplified the shock when the truth finally emerged. The world has always been fascinated by the idea of power, but true power often grows in silence, like roots beneath the earth, unseen yet unrelenting. India's nuclear capability was precisely that, rooted deeply in determination, watered by sacrifice, and shielded from the storms of global scrutiny. The silence was not a weakness, but a strategy. Each passing year without disclosure allowed knowledge to deepen, technologies to refine, and strategies to mature until the quiet rise became impossible to ignore. America, long accustomed to measuring strength in terms of visibility and dominance, failed to perceive the deliberate quietness of India's progress. Its intelligence networks probed, its analysts speculated, but what they encountered was a nation skilled in misdirection, blending its advancements into the background of civilian programs and peaceful pursuits. This was not the rise of a reckless power, but of one that understood the value of timing, the importance of restraint, and the impact of revelation when the world least expected it. Consider the patience it takes for a nation to build silently while enduring pressure from adversaries and scrutiny from allies alike. India's scientists, policymakers, and military minds formed a symphony of discretion, where each note was played with precision, and the harmony was silence itself. This rise was not accompanied by grand speeches or parades, but by the quiet hum of machinery and hidden facilities, the meticulous scribbling of equations on chalkboards, and the tireless nights of men and women who knew their work was shaping history, even if the world would not see it until much later. The true shock for America was not merely in the discovery of India's nuclear capability, but in the realization that it had been built under their gaze, yet beyond their grasp. A nation underestimated, often spoken of in terms of poverty or potential rather than power, had crafted a legacy of resilience that could not be ignored. The silence was not simply a cloak, it was a statement. It declared that India needed no validation, no external applause, and no approval to rise. It needed only its own will, and that will was unbreakable. Like the tectonic plates shifting unseen beneath the earth until the tremor is felt, India's nuclear progress was an invisible force waiting for its moment to be recognized. Each underground test, each quiet success, was a reminder that silence is not emptiness, but the most profound kind of preparation. To rise without spectacle, to advance without warning, is to create not only power, but shock. For shock is born when the expected is overturned and the underestimated becomes undeniable. America's unprepared reaction to India's revelation was not born out of ignorance, but out of assumption. For decades, the United States had viewed the global nuclear landscape as a stage dominated by a few central players, its own towering arsenal, the long shadow of Russia, and the unpredictable ambitions of nations like China and North Korea. Within this carefully constructed worldview, India was often placed in a category of regional importance, significant but never threatening to the established order of power. The revelation of India's hidden nuclear strength tore through that assumption like lightning through a calm sky, leaving shockwaves that reached the highest offices of Washington. In the halls of American intelligence, countless files had been written on India's technological pursuits, its scientific community, its ambitions for energy, and its regional concerns. Yet, for all the documentation, the interpretation was narrow. India's progress was often dismissed as slow, cautious, or limited in scope. When whispers of capability did emerge, they were softened by the belief that India's goals were defensive, its ambitions modest. The sudden confirmation of a fully developed and highly capable nuclear arsenal shattered this illusion, forcing America to confront the unsettling reality that it had been looking in the wrong direction. The unpreparedness was not just technical, it was psychological. America, accustomed to dictating the pace of international nuclear discourse, suddenly found itself reacting rather than leading. The unveiling of India's capability was not just a technological revelation, it was a geopolitical awakening. For a nation that had long considered itself the gatekeeper of nuclear power, the discovery that another had walked silently through the gate without permission was deeply unsettling. It was as though a carefully guarded vault had been breached, not with noise and force, but with quiet precision that left no room for denial. In Washington, the response was layered with disbelief, frustration, and grudging respect. Advisors scrambled to interpret the implications. Analysts debated how such advancements had gone unnoticed. Politicians questioned whether America's policies of oversight and sanction had failed, while military planners began to redraw maps of strategy and influence. What made the revelation so impactful was the realization that America's systems of surveillance, so advanced and so trusted, had been outmaneuvered by India's mastery of concealment. This was not merely a matter of secrecy, it was a lesson in humility, showing that even the greatest powers could overlook the quiet determination of a nation that refused to be underestimated. The reaction also carried with it a sense of vulnerability. For decades, America had relied on its ability to anticipate threats before they matured, to contain ambitions before they reached fruition. With India, the opposite had occurred. The threat, if it could be called that, had matured in silence, beyond the reach of intervention, and presented itself only when fully formed. This meant that America was not facing a potential capability, but a realized one, and the shock of that sudden leap reverberated through every corridor of its defense establishment. Diplomatically, the revelation presented America with a dilemma it had not prepared for. The dilemma. To oppose India outright risked alienating a rising democratic power in Asia, one that shared concerns about regional stability and global security. To embrace India's newfound strength, however, meant acknowledging that its own systems of control were fallible, that another power had joined the nuclear stage without America's consent. This tension created a moment of paralysis, where every move seemed both necessary and dangerous, every choice both opportunity and risk. The unprepared reaction also revealed the fragility of perception in global politics. America had long positioned itself as the architect of international order, the nation whose approval or disapproval shaped the legitimacy of others. India's revelation bypassed this entire framework, forcing America to acknowledge not what it wished to be true, but what simply was true. The shock lay not just in the existence of India's arsenal, but in the fact that America's role as arbiter had been circumvented. It was a reminder that the world was larger than its gaze, and that power could emerge from quarters it had not fully considered. And in the end, the unpreparedness of America's reaction was a mirror reflecting its own assumptions. It revealed how much had been taken for granted, how often strength had been measured only in visible terms, and how easily the quiet determination of a nation could be overlooked until it demanded recognition. India had not asked for permission, nor had it sought validation. Its revelation was its own declaration, and in that moment, America's reaction was not one of control, but of realization. The balance of power shifting in Asia was not a sudden tremor, but a gradual tilt, an invisible current that had been flowing quietly beneath the surface for years. For centuries, the Asian continent had been a battleground of influence, where empires rose and fell, and where global powers often treated its nations as pawns in a larger game. Yet now, with India's hidden nuclear capability revealed, the tectonic plates of geopolitics began to shift in ways that could no longer be ignored. The center of gravity, once firmly controlled by the giants of the West and later shared with China's assertive rise, now faced a recalibration, one that elevated India from the periphery to the very core of the strategic balance. In the Asian landscape, China had long stood as the dominant challenger to American power, its military strength and economic expansion casting a wide shadow across the region. Pakistan, armed with its own nuclear arsenal, had been both a concern and a pressure point for India, often amplified by outside powers. But the revelation of India's strength redrew the map of this rivalry. No longer was India simply reacting to the threats of its neighbors. It was now defining the terms of the competition. With nuclear capability firmly established, India shifted from being a cautious participant in regional affairs to a decisive force capable of shaping the direction of Asia's future. This shift was not just military, it was psychological. Nations across Asia, from small states in the Indian Ocean to emerging economies in Southeast Asia, began to see India not merely as a regional player, but as a stabilizing or destabilizing force whose choices would impact their own futures. The very knowledge that India could no longer be coerced or cornered by nuclear threats from its neighbors created an aura of authority. In diplomacy, perception is often as powerful as reality, and India's new perception was that of a nation that had crossed a threshold into untouchable status. This perception alone began altering alliances, partnerships, and strategies throughout the region. For America, which had long relied on a balance where China and its allies could be contained through careful engagement, the rise of India introduced a new dimension. Suddenly, the United States was forced to consider India not just as a partner of convenience, but as a pivotal actor whose choices could either support or disrupt American interests in the region. The balance of power was no longer a binary contest between the United States and China, but a triangular dynamic with India as the third point, silent, strategic, and unpredictable. Such a shift complicated existing policies, but it also opened opportunities, for in India's rise lay the potential to counterbalance China in ways America itself could not achieve alone. China, too, felt the weight of this transformation. Accustomed to viewing itself as Asia's undisputed powerhouse, its perception of India had often been tinted by condescension, seeing its neighbor as divided by domestic challenges and distracted by development needs. The revelation of nuclear strength shattered that comfort, forcing Beijing to confront the reality of a peer competitor rising to its west. Every calculation, from border disputes to influence in the Indian Ocean, now had to be reconsidered under the shadow of India's newfound deterrence. Where once China could apply pressure, now it would need to tread carefully, for the balance of risk had changed dramatically. Pakistan, perhaps the most directly affected, experienced the shift as an existential shock. Its long-held belief in nuclear parity with India, a fragile balance that provided it with strategic confidence, was suddenly undermined. The quiet sophistication and concealment of India's progress suggested not only superiority, but unpredictability. For a nation whose identity and strategy were built around countering India, this revelation struck at the heart of its security doctrine. The balance of power was no longer a delicate equilibrium. It was tilted, and with that tilt came uncertainty that rippled through military and political circles in Islamabad. Even nations far removed from direct confrontation felt the shift. Japan, Vietnam, and other Asian states facing China's assertiveness saw in India's rise a potential partner, a counterweight that could help preserve their autonomy. The Gulf states, reliant on energy. What made this shift so profound was that it could not be reversed. The revelation of India's strength marked a permanent change in the calculus of Asia, a line that once crossed could never be undone. The balance of power, long fragile and often manipulated by external actors, had been recalibrated from within, by a nation whose rise was self-determined. The shock to America was significant, but the deeper tremors spread through Asia itself, where every nation now had to account for India's presence, not as a possibility, but as an undeniable force at the heart of the continent. India's mastery of secrecy and precision was not an accident of circumstance, but the deliberate outcome of discipline, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to protect its ambitions from prying eyes. In an era where surveillance satellites circled the skies, where intelligence agencies dissected every movement of men and machines, India managed to shield its most vital project from the relentless gaze of global power. This was not the work of one generation alone, but a continuum of determination, passed down from leaders to scientists, from policymakers to military planners, each understanding that the nation's security depended not only on strength, but on the art of concealment. Secrecy was cultivated like a craft. Facilities were placed in remote deserts, laboratories concealed behind innocuous names, and activities disguised under the veil of civilian programs. Scientists who carried the burden of knowledge worked in silence, often cut off from the recognition they deserved, their achievements hidden even from their own families. What emerged was a culture of quiet excellence, where every breakthrough was celebrated not with fanfare, but with greater discretion. This secrecy was not born of fear, but of foresight. India understood that premature revelation would invite external pressure, sanctions, and attempts to halt its progress. To reveal too soon would be to risk everything, and so silence became the shield behind which precision could flourish. Precision itself was the natural companion of secrecy. To work in the shadows required eliminating error, for even the smallest mistake could draw attention. Each calculation was checked and rechecked, each experiment conducted with the utmost care, each advancement folded seamlessly into the rhythm of a program designed to leave no trace for outsiders to detect. The result was not just technological success, but the creation of a system where discipline was paramount, and where the pursuit of accuracy became second nature to every individual involved. The precision was not only in the machines and designs, but in the very manner in which information was handled, compartmentalized, and shared only with those who absolutely needed to know. America, with all its vast intelligence networks, satellites, and diplomatic channels, failed to penetrate this wall of silence. Reports filtered in, suspicions surfaced, and whispers circulated in Washington, but each time the picture remained incomplete. What they could not see was the careful choreography behind India's concealment. Decoys were used, civilian energy projects doubled as veils, and testing schedules were masked with layers of misdirection. India's planners played a long game, one that anticipated the very questions America would ask and provided answers that led them astray. This was secrecy not as avoidance, but as strategy, where every move was designed to maintain control of perception. The brilliance of India's mastery lay also in its patience. In a world obsessed with speed and display, India chose delay and restraint. Projects were stretched not because of incompetence, but because the timing of revelation was as important as the achievement itself. To complete a weapon in secret was one thing, but to unveil it only when the moment was right was another, more powerful act. This patience allowed India to control the narrative, to choose the moment when silence would give way to shock, and when precision would be revealed as power. Even within the nation itself, secrecy was a delicate balance. Politicians, military leaders, and scientists had to cooperate without allowing ambition or rivalry to compromise the mission. This required discipline on a scale rarely seen in large bureaucracies where leaks are common and pride often demands recognition. Yet in India's case, personal ambition bowed before national necessity. Those who worked in silence did so, knowing their names might never be remembered, but their sacrifices would shape the destiny of 1 billion people. Precision, in this sense, was not only technical but moral, the precise alignment of will, sacrifice, and purpose toward a goal too important to risk. For America, the eventual realization of India's mastery was deeply unsettling. It revealed that power could grow not through visibility, but through invisibility. It showed that secrecy, when combined with discipline, could outmaneuver even the most advanced surveillance systems. Most importantly, it forced America to acknowledge that India had achieved in silence what others could not achieve even with spectacle. This revelation was not only about nuclear capability, but about the capacity of a nation to think, plan, and act with a precision that defied the expectations placed upon it. Strategic implications for global security unfolded the moment India's hidden nuclear power came into view, for such a revelation was never contained within the borders of one nation, Amitu. The shock of discovery rippled outward, unsettling calculations and doctrines that had been meticulously constructed over decades. Nuclear power, by its very nature, alters not just the military capacity of the state that wields it, but the assumptions of every other power forced to coexist with it. With India's revelation, the architecture of global security, long fragile and carefully balanced, shifted into a new and unpredictable form. At the heart of these implications lay deterrence. India's capability instantly redefined the equation of risk for its adversaries. to its adversaries. Pakistan, long reliant on its own nuclear arsenal as a shield against India's conventional superiority, was forced to confront the reality that its sense of balance was an illusion. The sophistication and hidden depth of India's program suggested not equality but asymmetry, and with that realization came instability. A cornered adversary, unsure of its standing, often behaves with greater recklessness, and this unpredictability injected volatility into a region already fraught with tension. The doctrine of deterrence, once thought to stabilize South Asia, now risked producing the very instability it was meant to prevent. China, too, faced new calculations. Its rise as Asia's dominant power was underpinned by a belief in its military and nuclear superiority. Yet India's revelation complicated that confidence. It introduced a rival capable of threatening Chinese interests not only along their contested borders, but across the Indian Ocean and beyond. This was not a challenge China had anticipated at this scale. Strategic planners in Beijing suddenly had to divide their attention between the Pacific, where America's presence loomed, and the subcontinent, where India's quiet strength had matured into undeniable deterrence. The two-front consideration that China had long projected onto others now reflected back upon itself, and this shift rippled through its military and diplomatic strategies alike. For the United States, the implications were subtler, yet no less significant. America had long sought to control the spread of nuclear weapons, to enforce a regime where legitimacy flowed through treaties and oversight. India's revelation bypassed this system, emerging as a nuclear power outside of the established frameworks, neither sanctioned nor constrained by them. This weakened the credibility of international non-proliferation efforts, exposing the limits of America's ability to dictate global norms. Other nations observing India's success could conclude that patience and secrecy might achieve what diplomacy could not, and this silent encouragement posed a threat to the stability of the global order. Beyond the great powers, smaller states, too, felt the tremors. Nations in Asia and the Middle East began to reassess their own vulnerabilities. Some saw India's rise as a shield, a potential partner capable of balancing larger threats. Others feared it as a precedent, a sign that the rules could be rewritten without warning. Security alliances, carefully built on assumptions of American protection or Chinese influence, now had to account for India's presence as an independent pole of power. This recalibration introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty is often the greatest destabilizer of all, for it erodes trust and inflames suspicion. The implications extended into the oceans, where strategic dominance is as important as land-based arsenals. India's position along vital trade routes, combined with its newfound deterrence, gave it the ability to influence not only regional security, but global commerce. Energy shipments, maritime disputes, and naval alliances all had to be reconsidered under the shadow of India's power. The Indian Ocean, once a quiet expanse largely overlooked in nuclear terms, now became a theater of strategic importance, its waters carrying both goods and the potential for confrontation. Global institutions, too, felt the impact. The United Nations, often struggling to maintain relevance in matters of security, faced questions about its ability to enforce resolutions or mediate disputes when nations could achieve strength in silence. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, already criticized for its unequal treatment of states, suffered a further blow, its credibility weakened by India's rise outside its framework. Each of these shifts eroded the sense of predictability upon which global security had long been based, replacing it with an atmosphere of suspicion, competition, and new alignments. What made the strategic implications so profound was the manner of India's revelation. It was not accompanied by threats or aggression, but by the simple fact of existence. Power declared itself without fanfare, and in doing so, it forced others to adapt. Every doctrine, every alliance, every strategy that had once ignored or underestimated India now had to be rewritten. The balance of deterrence, the legitimacy of institutions, the alignment of powers, and the stability of oceans all were touched by this single revelation, and in their shifting, the entire edifice of global security was forced into a new and uncertain shape. America's dilemma. Rivalry or reluctant respect emerged as the defining question in the wake of India's revelation, for the United States found itself caught between instinct and necessity. On one hand, the instinct of a superpower accustomed to shaping global narratives was to view India's sudden display of nuclear capability as a challenge to its authority. On the other hand, the necessity of a shifting world order demanded that America recognize India not as a rogue force to be contained, but as a rising partner whose strength could no longer be ignored. This tension placed America in a position it rarely occupied, uncertain, reactive, and divided within itself. The path of rivalry seemed at first the natural response. America had invested decades into building the architecture of non-proliferation, a structure designed to keep nuclear power concentrated among a select few. India's achievement, conducted outside the treaties and frameworks that America had worked so hard to maintain, was a direct affront to that vision. To accept India's rise without consequence risked undermining every warning, every sanction, every act of deterrence that Washington had imposed on other nations. Rivalry, therefore, offered the comfort of consistency, the ability to reaffirm America's role as the guardian of nuclear legitimacy. Yet such a path carried risks that extended far beyond principle. For one, to treat India as an adversary would be to push it further into independence, or worse, into alignment with powers less friendly to America's interests. The memory of America's Cold War stance when India leaned toward the Soviet Union out of necessity still lingered in the corridors of Washington. A repeat of such estrangement could tilt the Asian balance irreversibly in favor of America's rivals. Moreover, India's rise was not that of an outlaw state defying the global order with threats and aggression. It was the rise of a democracy, a nation whose values, at least on the surface, resonated with those that America often claimed to defend. To rival such a nation would require painting it as a danger, a narrative far more difficult to sustain when India's strength was framed as defensive and measured rather than reckless. The alternative was reluctant respect. To respect India's power meant acknowledging the failure of oversight, the inadequacy of America's ability to dictate the course of other nations. It meant admitting that strength could emerge outside of the frameworks it had established, and that control was no longer absolute. Respect, however reluctant, also opened doors to opportunity. A strong India could serve as a counterweight to China, whose rise had become America's central strategic concern. Partnership with India, however uneasy, could offer advantages in a region where America's influence was increasingly contested. To embrace this path would be to swallow pride in exchange for pragmatism, to shift from opposition to cooperation, and to weave India's power into the broader fabric of shared interests. Inside Washington, these two paths collided in debates that stretched from think tanks to the Oval Office. Military advisors warned of the dangers of ignoring India's growing arsenal, of the risks posed by a power outside of America's direct influence. Diplomats, meanwhile, argued for engagement, emphasizing that alienating India would achieve nothing and that cooperation, even if imperfect, could yield strategic dividends. Politicians weighed the domestic optics of either choice, calculating how the American public would react to a stance that was either confrontational or conciliatory. The dilemma was not merely strategic, it was existential, a test of how America defined its role in a world where its dominance was no longer uncontested. The world watched closely, for America's response would set the tone for others. If rivalry prevailed, it could trigger a cascade of confrontations, sanctions, and counter-alliances, hardening divisions across Asia and beyond. If respect emerged, however reluctantly, it could reshape the global order by recognizing India as a legitimate pillar of power, altering the way nations aligned themselves in the decades to come. In either case, the dilemma revealed more about America than about India. It exposed the limits of a superpower's control, the fragility of its assumptions, and the uncomfortable truth that the world was no longer shaped by its will alone. What gave the dilemma its sharpest edge was time. America could not delay its choice indefinitely. Every day of hesitation allowed India to consolidate its position, to build alliances, and to project its newfound status with greater confidence. The longer Washington debated, the more the balance tilted toward acceptance, for power once revealed could not be erased, and the act of recognition often followed inevitability. Thus, America's dilemma was not only about rivalry or respect, but about whether it would lead events or follow them, whether it would cling to a fading order or adapt to a new one, in which India stood as an undeniable force. The psychological shock of an underestimated nation reverberated across the world the moment India's hidden nuclear strength was revealed. For power is not only measured in weapons and strategies, but in the stories nations tell about each other. For decades, India had been cast in a narrative of contrast, an ancient civilization rich in culture but struggling with poverty, a democracy alive with voices but burdened by chaos, a nation with promise but always portrayed as just short of realization. This lens of underestimation shaped how the West, and particularly America, viewed India. To see such a nation suddenly emerge with a capability so sophisticated, so concealed, and so decisive was not simply a military revelation. It was a psychological upheaval that shattered long-held assumptions. Underestimation had been a tool of comfort. For America and other powers to believe that India was incapable of developing such strength in silence was to believe in their own superiority, their ability to monitor, predict, and control the world's trajectory. The shock, therefore, was not just at India's achievement, but at the failure of their perception. It was the realization that a nation they had quietly patronized had, without their approval or recognition, joined the highest ranks of global power. The psychological impact of such a moment cannot be understated, for it undermines confidence not only in how India was seen, but in how the world itself was understood. The revelation cut deeply into the pride of intelligence agencies and defense establishments that had built their reputations on anticipating threats before they matured. To discover that India's power had matured in silence forced them to question the reliability of their methods, the strength of their assumptions, and the arrogance of their certainty. This was more than embarrassment. It was disorientation. If India, underestimated and overlooked, could achieve such secrecy and precision, what else might be unfolding unseen? The question spread unease far beyond South Asia, casting doubt on the very frameworks used to understand global security. For the American psyche, the shock carried layers of contradiction. On one hand, admiration for India's discipline and determination stirred a reluctant respect. On the other, a sense of betrayal lingered, as if a partner had acted in secret, revealing a side that America had never fully acknowledged. The underestimation had allowed comfort, the comfort of believing in a predictable India. That comfort was gone, replaced by the unsettling awareness of a nation that had grown beyond the limits imposed upon it by foreign perception. Psychological shifts were not limited to America alone. Within Asia, neighbors accustomed to viewing India through a lens of superiority or rivalry were forced to reconsider their own positions. For China, the shock lay in the collapse of condescension, the sudden realization that India was not a secondary power trailing behind, but a peer competitor capable of matching strength in unexpected ways. For Pakistan, the psychological blow was even sharper. Its identity, deeply tied to the notion of parity with India, was fractured by the revelation that India had leapt ahead in ways it could neither match nor predict. Shock here was not abstract. It was visceral, striking at the core of national pride and security. Even within India itself, the psychological dimensions were profound. For a people long accustomed to hearing their nation underestimated, the revelation became a moment of silent vindication. It was not triumph shouted from rooftops, but a quiet satisfaction that discipline and patience had prevailed over doubt and dismissal. The psychological transformation within India was one of confidence, a newfound belief that the world could no longer overlook its strength, that the story of underestimation had been rewritten by its own hands. The broader world, too, absorbed the shock in subtle but lasting ways. Allies who had long depended on American oversight realized that the global order was not as tightly controlled as they believed. Rivals who had dismissed India as distracted or divided were forced to rethink their calculations. And ordinary people across nations were reminded that power often hides in silence, that the underestimated may one day alter the course of history. In this sense, the shock was not confined to governments or militaries, but entered the realm of collective consciousness, reshaping how India was perceived by millions who had never considered it a central force on the global stage. The power of psychological shock lies in its permanence. Once assumptions are broken, they cannot easily be rebuilt. The image of India as an underestimated nation was shattered forever, replaced by the enduring memory of a country that revealed its strength on its own terms, in its own time, and in a manner that no one had foreseen. That memory lingers, shaping every future calculation, every negotiation, every alliance, for the mind does not forget the moment it realized it had been wrong.